I'd like to introduce Sir Mark Walport. All of you know that he's Chief Science Advisor to the British Government, Head of the Government Office of Science, former Director of the Wellcome Trust, has done an enormous amount to think about issues of risk, crisis management and so forth, and I suspect that's where he's going to focus his talk today. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter, and congratulations on organising this meeting. I must say I'm not known for either my sporting prowess or for sporting metaphors, but I did agree with Ian Chubb that one does have to play this with a straight bat if you're going to be a science advisor. And the other thing I would say is that hopefully, unlike cricket, providing science advice, one can talk about it, but it is ultimately a contact sport. My talk was prepared, but I have adapted it, having listened to the various presentations today, and I will respond to a number of the things that have been said. So, as you've already heard from Peter Gluckman, it is actually, by chance, the 50th anniversary of the first government chief scientific advisor in the UK, who was Sir Solly, later Lord Zuckerman. But of course, if you look back at the history of science advice in government, it does go back to defence largely. And you could say that in the UK, the first scientific advisors were Tizard and Lindemann, who were advisors between the world wars and played an extremely important role. And anyone who's been to Ditchley could see the very close relationship that Winston Churchill, Prime Minister, had with Lindemann, later Lord Cherwell, because they appear together in the visitor's book, having come frequently together at the weekend to talk about, and the wartime government was, the cabinet, the equivalent of Chequers was at Ditchley. So what is the role of the government chief scientific advisor? Now, first of all, I want to deal with something that was talked about earlier. There is a word that is not in English that encompasses the nature of science for the purposes of science advice, and it's the German word Wissenschaft. And so, although people talk about chief scientific advisor, I think that science encompasses science, engineering, technology, and social science. It is all these sciences, it is Wissenschaft. And I don't think one can provide the best advice unless you take that very broad view. I'm very fortunate because I have good resources to do my job as Government Chief Scientific Advisor. So I'm supported by the Government Office for Science, and I'm supported by a network of Chief Scientific Advisors across government. And in fact, I'm the head of profession for the government science and engineering profession. And there are well over 10,000 scientists employed throughout government. But what I would say is that the domain skills that we have represented across the chief scientific advisors means that most areas of science are in fact covered. And of course, you've already heard from one of my closest colleagues, Ian Boyd, in the last session, and indeed many of the most intractable and difficult problems that government faces, which, as Ian so nicely pointed out, you can't get away from, you can't duck these issues if you're in government, are in the area of agriculture, the environment, plant and animal health. In terms of my reporting line, I report to the Prime Minister and I report to the Cabinet Secretary, and I work across government. But it's also worth saying that if you're going to be an effective Chief Scientific Advisor, you need to find out who the people to work with really are. And a lot of my work is actually working with my fellow permanent secretaries. And to be clear, I'm not a political appointee. I am a classical civil servant. I am a Sir Humphrey, though I try not to behave like one. But I am a permanent secretary, and when governments change, I stay, and I have no political views whatsoever. And I think that the key advantages, and Anne Glover has brought this out already, and I'll come back to it in a minute, is, and in fact others have done it as well, there's speed, because one has got to be able to respond to government in the timescale that's relevant to government. It simply is no use saying to a minister, terribly sorry, Minister, that's the wrong question, give me £1 million and I'll come back in 5 years and give you the answer. It just doesn't cut the mustard. Continuity is important. It's being there throughout the whole of the policy process, from the initiation to the execution. It's about the integration. And I'd say that it is particularly useful having a standing mechanism at times of emergency. That actually is ultimately when the trust is really built between the politicians and the scientists, because in an emergency, when there is ash emerging from that volcano in Iceland, that is a situation where actually science becomes preeminent, because it is largely an engineering question as to whether one can fly a jet aircraft safely through the particles that Anne illustrated with the scanning electron micrograph. So ultimately, form should follow function. And there's a terrible tendency for people to worry about form before they've thought about what the function is. And I just want to pick up something that was said earlier, which is, it was pointed out, well, what is it that scientists know that politicians ought to know? Well, actually, there's the other side to that question, which is, what is it that politicians know that scientists need to know if they're going to be able to advise them properly? And I think there is a terrible tendency to review, to almost sort of deify the science, as though, and to look at the deficit model, which is, it's a sort of public understanding, the idea that we know we need to tell them. It's actually about engagement. They're very smart individuals, and as I'll come to talk about, when politicians are solving problems, they need to look at them through a variety of different lenses. So to be useful, we have to be relevant. And so ultimately, science advisors have got to think about what are the things that government really cares about. And finally, at this point, I'd say, if you're going to be effective, you have to do things with government, not to government. And so if I want to get something done in the area of energy, for example, then I'm much more likely to be effective if I work with the permanent secretary in the Department of Energy and Climate Change, with the ministers, so that they agree with me that the investigation that I'm going to pursue is relevant to them and they want to know the answer. And that in no ways compromises the independence of the process in getting the best advice. But you have to get buy-in, and that's about discussing the questions and working with government to identify what are the important questions, and then you're much more likely to get buy-in with the answer than simply going off and doing all this stuff and turning up in a minister's office and saying, well, this policy is all wrong, or that policy is all wrong, this is what the science says. So what is it that government really cares about? And I would argue that a principle of all good governments is that they should really care about two fundamental things. The first is the health, the well-being, the resilience, and the security of the population. And the second, and of course it's entirely interrelated, is the economy. Because you need a decent economy if you're going to be able to provide the security, the resilience, the health, and the well-being to your population. And what is it that really determines our health, well-being, resilience, and security? And it's actually our infrastructure. It's the infrastructure that we take for granted until it goes wrong, when suddenly, particularly in the most advanced and efficient societies, we suddenly find that actually our resilience is reduced because, for example, when you have just-in-time supply lines, when something goes wrong, then your shops are empty extremely quickly. And so when you think about infrastructure, there are two types of infrastructure. There's the human-built, engineered, manufactured cyber infrastructure. And what's paramount in that, of course, is energy, because if the energy stops working, then actually everything else stops working. The water stops flowing, the IT systems that we depend on stop working, the GPS all goes off, and so we need power. But it's all of the infrastructure. And so that's one thing that government cares about. And then, of course, the second aspect of infrastructure is our natural infrastructure, which, again, we take for granted until it goes wrong. And that, of course, is human and animal health, it's biodiversity, it's climate, it's weather, it's the natural environment as a whole. And so there's a wealth of scientific issues in that. And I think a scientific advisor, to be most effective, has got to be strategic. You've got to pick your problems. Eventually, as the famous saying goes, it is events, dear boy, events that actually determines what happens. But fortunately, most of the time, there's a bit of time between events. And then science in emergencies, and I'll say much more about that in just a second. On the economy, I think everyone recognizes, everyone talks about knowledge economies, what's an ignorance economy. It's actually about bringing together science, engineering, technology between industry, academia, and government. The role is a catalytic role, and I think a lot of the role of a decent scientific advisor is to be catalytic. And then we've talked about science for policy, and that is a lot of what a science advisor does. There is also policy for science, and of course one can't completely divorce the two, because if we're to be able to provide the best scientific advice, then we need a policy that allows the environment in which science can flourish to provide that advice in the first place. Now, I think a lot of the job of a chief scientist is to be a transmission mechanism between the scientific expertise that sits both inside government but outside government, and indeed around the world, and government on the inside. And so in order to do that, you need the receptor mechanisms in government to provide your advice. And there's no single mechanism there, there's a variety. So my job is to advise the Prime Minister, and I have one-to-ones with him and the Cabinet, and from time to time I go and talk to the Cabinet. There's, as I've already said, an array of departmental CSAs, Chief Scientific Advisors, and between us we have the terrific array of domain skills. And it's important to work as closely with officials as it is with politicians. There's SAGE, it's one of the better acronyms, Scientific Advice Group in Emergencies, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. And then there are councils and advisors as well, and I co-chair a body called the Council for Science and Technology with Dame Nancy Rothwell, who's the president of Manchester University, and it's in fact a very similar structure to the American committee, PCAST, President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, which again is chaired by John Holdren and an outside chair, Eric Lander. And then another important role of the job is actually in foresight and horizon scanning, and we've heard a fair amount of that at the moment, because only if you look forward are you able to potentially identify the issues before they happen, rather than waiting for something to happen. And if you like, the engine room, or where the scientific advice, where the expertise, where the experiments and observations are done, is throughout the country and internationally. So it's the Government Science and Engineering Network, and as I say, there are many, many scientists working in government. There are public sector research establishments. There's things like the Met Office, which is extremely important in any national emergency, Geological Survey, National Physical Laboratory. There's a whole array of those. There's the learned academies, and we've heard a fair amount from those today. There's the Royal Society, the Royal Academy of Engineering, British Academy, and the Academy of Medical Sciences. There's academia, there's the universities, and you can see there's a fair number of logos there. There are no university logos, because if I put any university logo, all the others would get furious, and I couldn't possibly put them all, so I'm afraid there are none. But the universities are obviously an extraordinarily important part of that. And then there is academia, and then there is industry. And what I care about is getting the best advice from wherever it comes from. And on the conflict of interest issue, the key there is transparency. There are obviously, from time to time, real conflicts of interest, in which case they may preclude a particular person giving advice on a particular thing. But because someone works for industry does not mean that they are incapable of giving valuable advice to government. It's just about transparency. Now, SAGE. I think this is one of the most important areas for scientific advice if it's done well. And it's one area where politicians, policymakers really, really need immediate, best scientific advice they can get. And so this is actually a very, very simple structure. In the UK, the top level group that manage emergencies is called COBRA. Nothing to do with the snake, Cabinet Office briefing rooms. Just committee rooms, basically. Chaired by the Prime Minister or a senior cabinet minister, and around the table are the relevant ministers and experts, police, army, whatever, to deal with any particular emergency. The Environment Agency, it just depends what the emergency is. And the Chief Scientific Advisor is a member of COBRA if it's something that has scientific implications. And then sitting under that is a committee which was established actually relatively recently by my predecessor, Sir John Beddington, called SAGE, which stands for Scientific Advice Group in Emergencies. And we work closely with the Civil Contingency Secretariat. The UK has a national risk register. It's available on the web. And I spend a lot of my time worrying about the national risk register, because if you use a risk register properly, it's about stopping things happening in the first place. It's about mitigating them if they do happen. It's then about handling them, and it's then about clearing up. And a risk register isn't something that just sit on a shelf. It's something that you have to actively use. We revise it, we review it, we rehearse, and we prepare manuals on how we would deal with it. But part of that is identifying the experts who can help in the event of emergency. So my office has a list of experts. It's not complete, but it's a good list of experts who we can summon at short notice in the event of a national emergency. And we meet as SAGE. We're multidisciplinary. We involve whichever chief scientists are relevant, typically a group of about 20 people or so, and we meet and we feed directly into COBRA. And it's the fact that this mechanism is up, ready, waiting, can be assembled very quickly. We work closely, we're just part of the system. The button gets pressed, doesn't matter what it is. Floods was the first one I was involved with. Flooding experts. We were able to convene a meeting in number 10 Downing Street, bringing international flooding experts. We brought people from the Netherlands and from the United States when we had major floods at the end of last year and the start of this year. And frankly, it's just a mechanism that works. And we are able to distill the best scientific advice. People are prepared to drop everything to join us. It's frankly very, very interesting. Because it's the opportunity to really apply science to work out the best state of the art during an emergency, so people are pretty keen to take part, actually. And we then communicate that to government and are involved in the whole way through. And these are just some of the examples. So in 2009, pandemic flu, volcanic ash in 2010, maybe again in 2014, who knows. Fukushima. And Fukushima was interesting because you might say, well, why was there a COBRA? Why did SAGE get involved in Fukushima? And it's for a very simple reason. Part of our responsibility is for UK citizens living overseas. And so there are plenty of British citizens living in Tokyo and in other parts of Japan. And we had to be able to give them good advice as to whether there was any need to evacuate, whether there was anything you need to worry about. And because we were actually able to assemble quickly people who knew not only about nuclear power plants, about Fukushima, but we had meteorologists who knew what direction the wind was going. We had people that knew about plumes and could model plumes. And with a lot of things, actually, in natural emergencies, if there's something that's sprayed into the air, gas, particles, whatever, then actually what you need to understand is how that will disperse according to the atmospheric conditions. And so plume models are actually very valuable. But they were basically able to put together the evidence and say that in the face of that, it was extremely unlikely that UK citizens living in Tokyo would be exposed to any excess radiation. Indeed, they'd probably be exposed to more excess radiation on the flight from Tokyo to the UK. And that message was got across very quickly. John Beddington had teleconferences with the UK community through the embassy in Japan. And I think that was helpful because at a time some other governments were telling their citizens to evacuate. The work had already been done because there was this standing mechanism that was there to do its job. And the reassuring message that was sent to UK citizens, I think, and I have got Japanese colleagues here who can tell me whether it's true or not, was quite helpful in Japan in calming down the crisis itself. And so I think this is really an important aspect of providing scientific advice to government. And it's something that I think the UK would now view as indispensable in a scientific emergency. But it starts with the risk register, it starts with, and we rehearse regularly, different events. So, how do we fit in with the policy process? Because this is another important part of it too. So one of the things is, I don't have executive power, I don't have an enormous budget. I have a very good office with about 65 people in it. But the impact of scientific advisors really comes ultimately through their personal abilities. It's about scientific standing, it's actually about energy, it's about interpersonal skills. And people sometimes say to me, particularly when I'm lecturing on topics that I didn't learn about at medical school, how can a doctor possibly do all of this? Well, one of my mentors, I think, characterized this rather well. If you're to practice medicine properly, you actually have to make decisions in the face of incomplete evidence. It's the nature of medical practice. It's very rare when you're making a clinical decision that you have all the evidence. And actually, one of the challenges for policymakers is making decisions in the face of incomplete evidence. As we've heard, there isn't a single right way to operate. There are many ways in which scientists can operate, but at the end of the day, if you don't have the interpersonal skills, I've seen plenty of extremely good academics who aren't able to be science advisors because they simply just don't get it. Rigorous scientific integrity is absolutely essential. It is, as Ian Chubb said in the last session, but it is often in the context of uncertainty. So if you're to be effective, you have to ultimately to influence policymakers. They have to want to listen to you. So you have to be tackling problems that interest them. It is about trust. It's about agreeing and understanding the questions. It's about socializing the questions with them. They may not initially respond and say, gosh, that's a question I want you to answer, but you have to explain to them and persuade them that the question is one that is important for them to understand. And then it's about providing the best evidence. But you have to recognize that science is only part of the process of making decisions by policymakers. And I think that's come out again and again, but I will illustrate it with some examples. And I think, again, if we're to be effective, there are all sorts of ways in which scientists can add value across government. Because one of the things that I have the privilege of doing is I sit absolutely at the center of government and I can peer into the cracks between government departments. And people sometimes say to me, you know, how do you work with this terribly siloed government system? And I point out to them that, of course, universities aren't in the least bit siloed. And so that's one of the important aspects of the job. It's about, for example, promoting the use of big data. One of the most important sources of evidence is actually government administrative data sets. You know, we heard from Hubert in the last session about the challenge for the long-term epidemiological studies. So how do we use data in the most effective way, recognizing legitimate public concerns about their privacy and their confidentiality and their identity? I think there's a very important role for scientists in government about being expert customers for science. So, for example, government has a national physical laboratory. Well, what is it the government expects from a national physical laboratory? So we have to be a good customer for science. What is it you expect from a Met Office? It's about, I think, working with the academies. So Geoffrey Bolton earlier talked about academies producing work, as it were, de novo. But if that's to have the maximum impact, then it does ultimately have to have a customer in government. And so I think it's about socializing the work of outside organizations within government. I'll say a little bit more about horizon scanning and foresight, where the government in the UK is taking an increased interest in this at the moment. And what we're doing is we're integrating horizon scanning and foresight work across government. And I basically co-chair an advisory committee with John Day, who's the chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee, on foresight and horizon scanning. And these are some of the problems that we're looking at the moment. So we're looking at future cities. Fascinating topic, enormous amount of work being done in this area, a topic of interest to almost every country. We're looking at aging society. That's in response to a House of Lords Select Committee report. And again, there are very few countries that aren't interested in that. We're looking at the Internet of Things. We live in a world now where manufactured objects almost all have embedded silicon chips, and increasingly these are all going to be able to intercommunicate one with another through the web, and that poses all sorts of interesting challenges. It offers economic opportunities, but it also offers a whole new set of vulnerabilities to people who might want to do bad things. And we're looking at financial technologies, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer last week announced that the Government Office of Science will be doing a piece of work on the future of financial technologies, which of course is integrated to some extent with the Internet of Things. And I'm not going to go into detail in the individual policy areas. Some of them are obvious. So genome science, energy, transport, the Internet, fisheries in this case. It's obvious, I think, to politicians and everyone else that science has important things to say in these areas. But the social sciences, as I've said, are also extremely important, and I will come back to those in a moment. And there are other areas where science has an enormous amount to offer. It's always struck me as a physician that the controlled trial which has been so influential in moving us towards evidence-based medicine, is something that is equally applicable in many other areas of society. It's difficult to do, and you know, whenever anyone says, well, we could do an experiment, it has a cost and an opportunity cost. If you do one experiment, you can't do another one, actually. But education is an obvious area where experiment can answer some of the questions about the best methods of pedagogy. Aid, how you provide that. Again, science in emergencies, prison policy, justice, policing. All of these are areas, too, where science has much to contribute. And in fact, the UK government has set out a whole series of what works centres, building on something called NICE, which is the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence, which looks at the evidence base around clinical interventions. Well, there are now what works centres looking at the effectiveness of educational interventions, of policing interventions. And I think this is a real, an important step in the direction of evidence-based policy. But I just want to talk about the different lenses, because scientists sometimes don't understand this as an issue. And let's take energy policy, and this is one that I think will be well known to everyone here. If you're going to have a sensible energy policy, you've got to look through three different lenses. You've first of all got to look through the lens of security of supply. You cannot have a situation where the lights go out. The second lens you have to look at is you've got to look at the environmental and sustainability lens, and the third lens is you've got to look at the affordability lens. And science can tell you the answer to some of these questions, but it's only a part of the story. And almost any problem, evidence is part of it, but it's not the whole. And so you could take the lenses in a slightly different way, which to say there is a lens of evidence, there's a lens of politics, and then there's a lens of the practicality of delivery as well. And it's somewhere at the intersection of that that ultimately policy is made. And the job of the scientific advisors is to feed in through the evidence lens. Now, engaging the public is a very important part of it, and it's a more or less important part of the job of different scientific advisors, depending on their individual roles. And it's clear that part of my job is about public engagement. And I think it's important to get out there because, again, the point has already been made that in democratic societies, ultimately it's the voters who decide who are going to be the politicians, the policymakers, and therefore it's important that there's good discussion with the voters. And I think that, again, something that isn't as well understood as it should be is the importance of public social values. If you don't take those into account, you know, the evidence may be absolutely clear-cut that, for example, fracking is a sensible way of obtaining methane gas. The engineering questions there are threefold, really, in the case of hydraulic fracturing. It's, is there going to be a problem with seismicity? Is there going to be a problem of contamination of water tables? And is there going to be unacceptable fugitive methane release? Those are the three engineering questions. And there have been endless independent reports, and the Royal Society and the Royal Academy of Engineering produced a good report, which essentially said, if you do hydraulic fracturing well, according to the book, then these risks are very small. Having said that, there have been protests in the UK about the potential for fracking. And when you talk to the people there, they don't talk about seismicity. They basically have three different motives. Some of them are worried about the fossil fuel industry. Some of them simply don't like big companies. And some of them don't want their immediate environment disrupted by fracking operations. But if you don't understand people's values, issues about fairness, equity, you know, I take the risk, you get the benefit. If they don't understand these issues, they're unlikely to be able to make good policy decisions. And Tim O'Riordan, who is a really excellent social scientist, has provided advice through the Council of Science and Technology. And he's set out sort of 5 broad principles around public engagement. One is that people need to be reassured that all potential alternative solutions are being looked at. So it's not we do this or nothing. It's these are the range of solutions. This is what each of them in turn means. Each has a benefit, each has a risk. Let's talk about the different options. The second is about, depending what it is, making the decision-making at the appropriate geographical level. In some cases, the appropriate geographical level is a national level. We need, as far as possible, to involve the public in decision-making. They need to own the decisions. We need to tailor communications appropriately. They need to be fit for purpose for the audiences that you're talking to. And he also makes the point that in some cases we need to engage the public's emotions and sense of responsibility in relation to advanced technologies. Actually having something in your neighborhood may be good for your local community, may be something you should be proud of. And one of the interesting things in the UK, and I don't think it's any different in other parts of the world, is that the UK is a country that is actually going ahead with further nuclear energy. And if you want to find where to put a nuclear power plant, the best place to put it is next to an existing power plant, because the community there have learned over very many years actually the benefit of having that in their community. There's nuances in all of these, and I suspect we could have a whole day on principles of public engagement. There's been quite a lot today already on Fukushima, and I don't want to dwell on it. But I think the interesting thing is that after the tragic event there, different countries made entirely different decisions based essentially on the same event and what should have been the same evidence, although to what extent that evidence was coherently expressed in different environments. But of course, as everyone here knows, the conclusions in different countries were very different. And in fact, if you look in the UK at public opinion around nuclear energy, the needle didn't really move. And you could say, or could ask, whether part of that was in fact the very swift COBRA response, the analysis, and the determination that actually, as has already been alluded to, WHO have pointed out that the harm to people directly from the radiation has been essentially non-existent from Fukushima, although the wave itself caused terrible mortality. So I'll finish very shortly, but there's an important job in terms of building capability. And I think that we need to continue to build capability. I was known at the Wellcome Trust because I was always saying we need to continue to raise our game. And I think it's true in every walk of life, actually. We continue to need to raise our game as science advisors. And so we need to develop our chief scientist community. We need to develop the scientists who work in government research establishments, the Met Office, the defense laboratories, who all have so much to add in terms of scientific advice themselves. And we need to build capacity from outside government, in universities, in academies, in industry. But I think there is something interesting going on in the UK, and I don't think it's probably unique to the UK, and that is that there is a pull for what is called open policy making. And I suspect that is going to be a fairly international phenomenon. It is actually a part of the movement for openness, that if you're going to be democratic, you need to open, you need to develop policy more openly. And that gives a tremendous opportunity. So within the civil service itself, there is a drive for much more open policy making, and that means talking to the outside world about policy. So I think the second thing is that I think that we have to continually work to increase the scientific literacy of those in government. And to anyone who complains that there are too few politicians who are scientists, then I would say to them, you can't blame the people that have stood. You can only blame the people that haven't. And so if you want more scientists, then more scientists need to stand. But I think that there is work. And one of the things that we're doing, and it's part of being an expert customer for science, is that we are developing a fast-track civil service scheme for young scientists who have PhDs or at the minimum master's degrees, who we will bring into the civil service and put in jobs which will train them as those future scientifically literate civil servants. The intention is not to train specialist scientists, but to train people who will come from scientific backgrounds who may ultimately be the Sir Humphreys of the future. And so that's government pull, which is increasing. On the other side, I think that the push is increasing, because there is this pressure, and again it's come up on several occasions today, for impact. It is the compact between society and academia the privilege of doing research using taxpayers' hard-earned money. And so there is pressure on impact, and that's not, I think, a threat to fundamental or blue skies research, but it's recognizing that there is a spectrum of research and that there are some problems that actually demand research. And so when there is an Ebola outbreak, it's no use saying, well, actually, I'm not really interested in doing research on Ebola. I work on Coxsackie C. There are certain scientific questions that actually demand that there are programs that are directed towards tackling the problems. But I think that increasingly we're not finding it difficult to get scientific advice from outside government. And indeed, I think there's increasing pride in being able to provide it. It's a good thing to do. You have a real impact if you can change a government policy through advice. Finally, there's been a lot about uncertainty. And I think some of the most misunderstood, misused words around uncertainty are risk, hazard, uncertainty, and vulnerability. This Egyptian, well, the hazard in this slide is fairly obvious. It's some very sharp teeth. The risk is that they'll snap on this Egyptian plover. We might be uncertain, looking at it, what the outcome in the next minute will be. The bird itself is actually relatively invulnerable because it's cleaning the crocodile's teeth. And so it can hop in and out with no difficulty at all, whereas if you put your hand in, you might end up minus one hand. And of course, the point is that the risk is a product of the hazard and the exposure. And all of this gets terribly confused, unfortunately. And I fear that we move increasingly in a world which is regulated according to hazards rather than risks. And the metaphor I use here is the household. Our kitchens are full of hazards. Salt is actually rather dangerous if you swallow too much of it. Bleach is definitely bad for you if you swallow it. Those kitchen knives that we cut our fingers with from time to time are absolutely deadly instruments. But we manage our everyday household hazards by managing our exposure. And I think one of the challenges for society is that as scientific methods for measuring things become more and more sophisticated and more sensitive, then in that bottle of water, you'll be able to find half the chemical universe. Does that mean it's unsafe to drink? Absolutely not. At least I think it's not unsafe to drink. So at the end of the day, we are only as good as our evidence, and Ian Boyd has already detailed some of the areas where I think that we have difficulties because it is uncertain. Neonicotinoid insecticides is something that agents that are excitement around the world. And there is a very real question as to whether at the levels at which they are properly applied in agriculture, where they're designed to kill, you know, there's people sometimes surprised that insecticides kill insects. Well, that's what they're designed to do. The question is whether they kill the insects you don't want whilst preserving the insects you do, or whether they kill too many of the insects you do want. And the only way you ultimately answer that is by doing very good field trials. Those are expensive and hard to do, but it's a hazard risk question. Bovine tuberculosis, Ian has already talked about. And our role is, at the end of the day, to communicate, to assess the balance of evidence, and then it's for the policymakers to weigh those up. We have to identify gaps in our knowledge, and as far as possible, look to fill them, but recognizing that, again, saying, well, you can do this experiment, it'll take you 5 years and cost £15 million, or whatever unit you work in. It's not always practical to say that there's more experiments will answer this. Ultimately, policymakers do have to deal with uncertainty. I'm not sure I really like the word post-normal science. I don't know what it means, actually. Science has always been complicated, messy. We're dealing with complex systems. But anyway, in these very complicated systems, ultimately policymakers have to make the decision. We have to provide the best evidence we can. And who should we listen to? Well, it's about a broad range of expertise. It's actually much easier to build consensus in an emergency when you literally have to make a decision in a day or two or a week or so. Then people do reach consensus. You may have very tough discussions in COBRA, but you'll get there. It's much harder to do that in some of these longer, slower burning issues. And part of good scientific advice is in communicating uncertainty effectively. So many problems now are global problems, and it's one of the reasons this is actually an extremely important meeting, and congratulations once again to Peter for your leadership in bringing it all together. Clearly, in terms of policy for science, some science is now so expensive that we simply can only do it by collaboration. There is some science that can only be done in certain places because the scientific question is localized to that place, or indeed in the case of astronomy, as I talked about briefly yesterday, there are only certain quiet parts of the planet where you can either see the skies at night or listen to them by radio waves. There are also a whole series of challenges where, again, characterized yesterday as ungoverned spaces, the oceans, space, the atmosphere, where we all actually ultimately share the same planet, and we need to collaborate if we're going to solve the scientific problems. So to finish, I think my summary is simple. Embedded science advice in government is extremely important, and it's frankly vital in emergencies. And although I've heard from those countries that think that you can do this by just going to the academies and others, personally, I don't think that's sufficient. I think you need a transmission mechanism that really works between them and government. And so having advisors inside government, and frankly, I think that the academies in the UK probably get more of a hearing because of the science in government than if there wasn't. You have to know your customer and also your provider. And I think it's all about ultimately acting as an effective transmission mechanism between the world of science and the world of politics. Thank you for your attention.